is twofold. Firstly, to give you a brief overview of some of the main themes that are contained in the collection of essays that we've launched today and that you should have had copies of as you came in. I think we've just about got enough copies printed for today's event, but there will be more available soon. But after that, and more importantly in a way, we have an excellent panel up here through which we're going to reflect more broadly on some of the remarks and points that Mark made in the session just now, and also on some of the other ideas that we've put forward in this collection. We have our three panellists. Firstly here, Claire Craig, who's Deputy Head of the Government Office for Science, Laura Haynes, who's Head of Policy Research within the Behavioural Insights team at the Cabinet Office, sometimes known as the Nudge Unit, and finally Ulrika Hottop, who is Director for Analysis and Chief Economist at DEFRA. So we're very pleased to have all three panellists here to discuss really where scientific advice is going and particularly how it fits within broader dynamics of Whitehall reform. Let me, as I say, just start with a few remarks about the collection. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to skim through. I should say, firstly, in addition to the thanks that Rob gave at the beginning of proceedings today, how grateful we are to the partners that came together to produce that collection and the series of events that led up to it, the Institute for Government, the Alliance for Useful Evidence, CSaP, of course, ScienceWise, Sprue and other colleagues in the STEP Centre at the University of Sussex, and also express our gratitude to the authors of the chapters in that collection. I think we've got a really excellent selection of ideas that I hope will stand the test of time. But in terms of what we draw from all of those essays, let me just pull out three or four of the overarching themes that are in the collection and then mention what we considered when we were putting this together to be some of the priorities for Sir Mark's tenure as GCSA, some of which he's already signalled that he intends to take forward. So within the collection, one of the main themes that came across, and Rob's already mentioned this, is this idea of experts as intermediaries. This is expressed very well by Jeff Mulgan in his essay when he talks about the key role of a science advisor being to act as an intermediary and a broker rather than an advisor. Consequently, he says their skills need to be those of translation, aggregation and synthesis as much as deep expertise. Sir John Beddington in his chapter makes a similar point when he describes the role of the GCSA as a conduit of advice rather than a single expert opinion. And we explore in some depth this idea of the expert as intermediary and talk about it in part in the context of the report, the inquiry into the network of chief scientific advisors that the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee conducted last year, producing its report in the spring of last year, which expressed some concern in that report about the unevenness in the status, authority and influence of chief scientific advisors across different government departments. The Lords report tries to codify what it considers the essential characteristics of a CSA that are required if he or she is to operate effectively. And foremost among these, what the Lords call the primary and essential characteristic, is that the CSA must have standing and authority within the scientific community, nationally and internationally. This isn't defined with precision, but essentially what the Lords report is saying is that the critical thing is who you put in post and then sort of how you reconfigure things around those individuals. That, of course, in many respects is true and a fair point, but I think the essays in the collection suggest, if not a different, at least a complementary emphasis to that primary and essential characteristic, and that is on this idea of intermediary skills. As Jeff Mulgan says, what might be characterised as the clever chap theory of scientific advice is somewhat outdated and inadequate to the task of policymaking in contemporary Whitehall. Simply putting an eminent scientist, Jeff says, into a department may have little effect. Many who aren't well prepared for their roles as brokers feel that they rattle around without much impact. Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government makes a similar point. So this idea of intermediaries, I think, is very crucial. And indeed, many of the measures that Sir John Beddington put in place and which Mark has spoken of already today recognise and are building on that point. Our second point, and this links to the idea of intermediaries, is that we need, in the way we think about the scientific advisory system, to shift some of our attention away from the experience, the status of the individual advisor, towards the dynamics of the wider advisory system in which they sit. We say in the report, in many ways, chief scientists are the charismatic megafauna of the science advisory jungle. And as a result, they do attract a lot of our attention. There's no end of reports, and I write about them a lot for good reason. But we need to recognise that there's this much bigger, richer ecosystem of expert advice, which includes analytical professionals within the civil service, external advisory committees, policy czars, national academies, learned societies, universities, NGOs, civil society organisations. The list goes on. And in their essays, Jill Rutter and Miles Parker explore how the role of this system, the way this system operates, is changing in the context of civil service reform as Whitehall grapples with tighter budgets, heightened demands for accountability, and this expressed desire within the civil service reform agenda to make open policy making the default model of policy. So we talk at some length about this. John Beddington in his chapter notes rather diplomatically that open policy making is still a fluid term. And Jill Rutter reminds us as well that previous attempts at civil service reform have faltered as the initial impetus fizzled out. But we are very interested in how the science advisory system fits with those wider dynamics. And a couple of the chapters in the collection go a bit further to push for a more radical interpretation of what open policy making might involve. Jack Stilgoe, Simon Burrell, in their essay, call for this more expansive notion of openness, which draws systematically on engagement and dialogue with the wider public, another thing that Sir Mark mentioned just now. And they point to a rather uneasy settlement within the advisory system since the BSE crisis between the old and the new model of expertise. And they ask whether open policy making will be more about open doors, welcoming in new perspectives, open minds, reflecting on the limits of centralised control and predictability, or transparent but closed windows, revealing policy but maintaining control of its contributors. So that's the sort of second big theme. The third is this idea of the science of scientific advice. We're all familiar with the prominent calls we hear from time to time across the science community for science to be given greater authority in policy and in politics. Such calls are often well-intentioned, but they can fall into the trap of reinforcing rather misleading or inaccurate accounts of the relationship between science and policy. And several of the essays grapple with this. Jeff Mulgan reminds us that there is a science as well as a craft of scientific advice. And he says we need to learn much more systematically from existing research and practice on why certain kinds of knowledge and advice are acted on and others are not. David Cleaveley describes the way in which network analysis can inform our understanding of how scientific advice works in practice and can assist in the construction of more intelligent systems of knowledge exchange. And in her essay, Sheila Jasanoff, Professor of Science Studies at Harvard, probes further into the foundations of scientific advice and tries to draw out some of the main insights that can be brought to these debates from science and technology studies. STS, I speak as an STS scholar who obviously used to work here at the Royal Society. I know this with bitter experience. STS can be associated with unproductive wheel spinning and relativism. But Jasanoff says those wheels can, in my view, spin with traction. And she concludes that the relationship between creators and critics of scientific advice is fraught but indispensable. In democracies, no institutions should place themselves beyond critique. If judges may not presume to stand above the law, still less should science advisors seek to insulate themselves from the critical gaze of the science of science advice. The fourth overarching theme, which has also been touched on in Sir Mark's remarks, is that of the disciplinary mix. This is a picture that we had in one of our reports here at the RS on the landscape of scientific publication and how it was changing. In his final session, just before he stood down as GCSA, John Beddington, speaking to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, expressed some regrets that particularly the status and place of social science within the CSA network hadn't received the prominence and attention in recent years since the departure of Paul Wiles, the former Home Office CSA. And there's been some discussion about the need or not for a new or for an additional chief social scientist within this broader mix. This is a case that's elaborated in the collection in an essay by Carrie Cooper, the president of the Academy of Social Sciences, and Stephen Anderson, his colleague. There's a lot to be said for that argument, but as we discuss in the collection, that it also raises a question. If we accept the case for a chief social scientist, how far do we follow it through? Do we settle for one social scientist coordinating everything at the centre alongside CSaP? Do we instead push for chief social scientists in every department, like we have chief scientists? And why stop there? How about a few chief philosophers able to interrogate ministerial logic and pose deep questions about the purpose of government? And as Rebecca Higgett and I say in our essay, and Mark's spoken about this, what about a few historians providing what Lord Butler, the former Cabinet Secretary, described recently as a rear mirror for the policy-making process? So there's an interesting debate to have there, and still a lot of this is implicit. It's not stated very clearly. It's great to see social science getting more prominence in these opening statements from CSaP, but sort of quite where we draw the line, what disciplines are sort of ranked where, is a rather opaque topic. And we suggest that there would be some benefit in sort of codifying this a bit more clearly and thinking just a bit more deeply about what the ideal balance is of disciplinary expertise across the CSA network and the wider advisory system as a whole. John Beddington raised the question in his remarks to the Commons Committee recently that, or suggested that an engineer could one day occupy the top job of GCSA. And I guess the question I would pose as a social scientist is, well, if an engineer could do it, could a social scientist? It at least is worth thinking about. So I think the point we're trying to make here is back to this idea of intermediaries. Creating standalone advisory structures for the social sciences, for engineering, for history is a rather clumsy solution which ducks the bigger challenge of how we integrate an appropriate mix of expert advice from all subject areas and, of course, from other sources outside of the university system within the policy-making mix. So those are the main themes. We then go on in the introduction to list 10 priorities, and I'm just going to whiz through those very fast. I don't want to take more of the time now. But just to go very fast through what we thought were 10 priorities for Sir Mark as he considers his role over the next few years. The first, of course, is to build on his predecessor's legacy. John Beddington, I think, is widely regarded to have had a very successful tenure as GCSA. The Guardian praised him in one of its in praise of columns the week he was standing down for having trodden a thin line with grace in the way he dealt with the various demands on the GCSA role. So there's a lot that Mark can, and I'm sure will do, to build on John's good work, particularly in this extension of the CSA network through Whitehall and this greater emphasis on the government science and engineering profession. Our second priority, and this has already been discussed to some extent, is how science is positioned within a leaner, meaner Whitehall and within the context of civil service reform and open policy making. And we think there's a chance here to really position the science profession and the science advisors as already doing a lot of this stuff very well, and in that sense acting perhaps as an example to other bits of Whitehall on how open policy making can be done better. But there's also a need to connect the science advisory piece with a lot of the stuff that people like Laura are pioneering through the Cabinet Office in terms of the use of things like randomised controlled trials and other methods in policy making, and of course the new network of What Works centres that the Cabinet Office has recently announced. Our third point was about banging the drum for investment in research. Mark has already demonstrated the vigour that he's going to bring to that task. He's talked about this. I would again reinforce that it's very important, in line with his wider role as a champion for evidence in policy, that this isn't the one domain in which he slides sort of back into advocacy or sort of trade union activism on behalf of the science community, but where he needs to continue also pushing for more evidence in underpinning the arguments we make I know, having been very involved in this here when we were producing the Scientific Century report in the run-up to the last election, both where the evidence is strong and also the areas where the evidence is weaker. Sir John Marburger, the former presidential science advisor to George Bush, received acclaim for asking some quite tough questions back in 2005 about the robustness of the evidence base in relation to investment in research. And that question, a speech he gave at the AAAS, led to the creation in the States of what's now quite a large and thriving program of science and innovation policy research. And I think one thing that Mark might like to consider is whether we need some sort of similar initiative here in the UK. I've talked already about the need to draw in the rich contributions that can come from across the university system. We talk at some length about this in the book. I won't say more about it now. But it's linked up with this whole idea of the crucial importance of intermediary brokering and translational skills. We do pose the question, and this is a bit more speculative, as to whether some years down the line, as we see the government science and engineering profession being strengthened, we already have, of course, the government economics service, whether there is a case for thinking in a rather more integrated way about a government evidence service that would bring together all of these different forms of analytical expertise within Whitehall and sort of organise and mobilise those in one more integrated way. I mean, this sort of bumps right up against the sort of cold heart of disciplinary and epistemic authority in the Treasury, so it's a tricky one. But I'd be very interested, for example, in Laura or Claire's reflections on this. We talk about keeping a cool head in a crisis, and Mark has already spoken about SAGE and the challenges of dealing with emergencies, which inevitably will crop up under his watch. We talk about his potential role. This is very much Ben Martin's question at the end there. What will be his big agenda? Sir David King, of course, championed climate change very prominently during his time as GCSA. Sir John Beddington talked about the perfect storm. There's a question as to what Mark's sort of big headline agenda will be. We do ask whether that agenda might itself be now more collectively designed and advocated and advanced by the network of CSAs as opposed to being associated with the GCSA as an individual. But that's something to think about. Jill Rutter, in her chapter, suggests that the CSA network should follow the model of the Chief Medical Officer in every year producing a sort of high-profile agenda-setting report. Jill thinks this could help to move the CSAs and their role more to the centre of the Whitehall policy discussion. So that may be something else to think about. But we do also say that alongside that agenda-setting role, there is a need for scientific advisors to bear in mind what Roger Pilkey says in his essay, that science advisors aren't superheroes. They aren't capable in some unproblematic way of representing the authority of science as a counterbalance to the messiness of politics. More often than not, science advice is about helping policymakers to navigate options rather than provide them with single answers. And I think this is particularly important when advisors are commenting on controversial issues such as GM, fracking, nuclear power, where we know there are very often more than just scientific issues at stake, and when it's not really doing justice to the complexity of those debates to narrow them down artificially. We're nearly there for our 10. Number 8 was to strengthen foresight, move it closer to the heart of industrial policy. Quite interesting, we've just been doing a study at Sprue with Nesta, looking at how different countries have been adapting their foresight programs in the wake of the global financial crisis, and in a number of countries aligning them more closely with wider agendas in industrial policy. We think there's more that could be done here to build on the already excellent work that foresight does. We do also suggest, as Mark says, that we might, in the mix of foresight, have a few people thinking about hindsight. I don't think it's an either-or. I don't think it needs a whole unit, but we do feel as part of this disciplinary discussion that's one area where historians of science and historians more widely could play an important role. Number 9, we talk about science diplomacy. This is Anne Glover giving a speech at one of the events that form part of this series down at Sussex. Here at the Royal Society, we did a big conference on science diplomacy a few years ago now, which led to this report, New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy. It's a very rich debate. It's got a lot more sophisticated in recent years, being pushed by the State Department in the US and by the FCO and others here. And it's a very important one, particularly at a time when the UK model of scientific advice is being looked to as a potential template elsewhere. Anne Glover, in her role in Brussels, is now doing a lot to try and advance the case for CSAs to be appointed in other EU member states. We've seen a lot of interest in Japan in the wake of the Fukushima episode and the contribution that Sir John made. A lot of interest in having a CSA-type role there. Similar debates in a number of countries. A couple of the essays in the collection talk about these. And that makes thinking internationally particularly important. And also thinking about what the fora are where science advisors and other people who are thinking about scientific advice can come together to share best practice and swap ideas. And that leads really to our last point. I was quite struck when writing the introduction to the collection that the GCSA is not the only early 60s British institution which has survived through 11 incarnations, again, all of them men. In the autumn, the BBC will be screening a special 50th anniversary episode of Doctor Who, which promises to reunite Time Lords and enemies past and present. And this led us to wonder what the equivalent celebratory milestone might be for the GCSA role. Next year in 2014 is the 50th anniversary of Sir Solly Zuckerman's appointment as the first sort of comprehensive GCSA in 1964. And we suggested that in light of the hope expressed in the collection by Jeff Mulgan and others, that we are entering a period of more experimental government, where policymakers are more willing to test their ideas out, to run RCTs, to embed continuous learning and feedback in all that they do. We suggest that Sir Mark might like to convene some kind of big international summit, bringing together policymakers, practitioners, scientists of science advice, and thinkers from around the world to reflect on progress, share ideas, and chart common agendas for experimental government in future. Such a meeting could also define the aspirations against which the legacy of Sir Mark's tenure as GCSA will eventually be judged. So thank you. That's my quick introduction. I'm sorry to take up time, but I thought it was worth giving you a flavour of what's in the collection. I'm going to hand over now to Claire as the first of our three speakers. We're going to hear a few remarks from each of them, and then we're going to have a discussion with questions. Thanks.
Somebody. Okay. Right, well, thank you, James. Mark set out his priorities for the Government Office for Science, and I think we're all really enjoying the kind of excitement and aspiration of what he's setting out. There is a lot of academic, in the good sense of the word, insight in the book, the collection of essays that's being published today, and will, I think, in the Government Office for Science, be spending some time thinking what it means for us. What I wanted to do right now was offer simply three further thoughts about what we're all gathered here today to discuss, from the point of view of a current practitioner, a civil servant, living through these things in the front line as we speak. And I think I could describe myself as an aspirational practitioner, because what I want to convey first is my real sense of the opportunity and also the urgency of distilling what we're talking about, what we're learning, and putting it into practice really rapidly. Because from the inside, what do we see? We see a civil service that it's at its smallest since the Second World War. It's been reduced by a quarter since the start of this government. It's a scary pressure, but it very much enables change and new ideas to find their way in quicker. So in some sense, we may have a once-in-a-decade chance to reshape the way that advice and evidence feeds into policy. The government is very clearly ideologically committed to transparency, to decentralisation, to trust in the front line, to professionals, within which I would include scientists, and all of this encapsulated in open policy making, which is a fluid term, which is good. It's not diplomatic to say it's fluid. It's up to us really to shape what open policy making means, to kind of ride with it and use it to find better ways of engaging science. Alice Bell's essay describes the kind of dizzying nature of the technological aspects of the trends that we're talking about. I thought a very sort of practical example for me would be a colleague of mine who is in the Better Regulation Executive, describing a very typical piece of quite relatively low profile government work, which is most of the time. She was reviewing the regulation of care homes. And just 2 years ago, what that would have meant at its worst was putting out a consultation document, waiting 3 months, maybe running a couple of workshops, getting back a small number of responses, some of them perhaps of relatively low common denominator quality from variable quality trade associations, cutting and pasting and giving it to ministers. That's a rude caricature, but now just a year later, using social media and using interactive websites, what her team were getting was real-time discussion between practitioners in care homes, frontline professionals, most of whom wouldn't have known the Better Regulation Executive, from whatever the opposite of it is. But they were discussing and developing new ideas. Now, it felt quite different to this policy official. And we'll probably go on to talk about what that means for using that kind of shift to better bring in academic and science knowledge, and also what we as a community, particularly those who've worked on public engagement, public dialogue with science, what we've got to offer in kind of really shaping and improving the way in which that kind of consultation and engagement goes on. But it does mean we're in a strong position. I'm showing on the other side of this slide. I have a chart on trust. This is trust in scientists to tell the truth, as opposed to, I don't know, fly an aeroplane that you're a passenger in or something. But the point here is we are still collectively in a very strong position to bring in scientists into this policy-making process as it shifts. And Mark showed a chart with the 3,500 government science and engineering members. They're at all levels of the civil service. I don't know what the opposite of a charismatic megafauna is, because I think some of these members of the community are extremely charismatic in their own right, but they are much more diffused, much more integrated, if you like, and able to support what goes on at the very top levels with the kind of iconic and really important symbolic actions of the CSAs. We have developed, through a major review that John Beddington commissioned and we carried out last year, we've developed much better understanding of that community and of how to, many of you are members of it, by the way, of how to really nurture, develop, increasingly find career paths for people who are working on the interface between science and government, moving perhaps in and out of it in either direction. We know better how to keep deep practitioners stimulated and stretched without requiring them to become the managers they don't want to be. And increasingly, we can find ways to develop career paths, as I say, that move in and out of science and policy. All of this means we shouldn't wait for others to define open policy making for us. We should use it. We should create it ourselves. So perhaps what we want is a generational shift. So my second suggestion is that that's the kind of analogy that we should be thinking of. On the left is a cartoonish illustration of the numbers that Mark had before. Broadly speaking, there are still about 400,000 civil servants. The triangle is, broadly speaking, 200,000 practicing scientists, one way or another. The interpenetration of the two, in terms of bodies at the moment, active people, is the 1 GCSA, 20 CSAs roughly, 1,800 to 2,000 academics each year, something like that. There's a huge amount more to play for in the transfer of people, and that's always one of the best ways of embedding different ways of thinking, better ways of bringing in evidence. But the trend is up, and the pipeline is building, and bodies like the Centre for Science and Policy, the impact element of the Research Excellence Framework, all reinforce it. We've got multiplying pairing schemes, multiplying secondment opportunities. Government Office for Science itself, in my 2 years there, has been really enriched by an increasing number of secondments in from academia and the amazing energy of science graduate interns. who are now a key part of how we work. My kind of challenge really to us all is to get an equivalent shift over time in scientists' desire and ability to contribute to policy and to public engagement, as I think we have seen broadly in the attitudes to commercialisation. So on the right, an illustration of the increase in business income to universities over a relatively short period of time, a decade. You know, it's only part of a generation. But actually, I remember Dave King, when he was GCSA, saying that when he started life in the chemistry department at Cambridge, the car park was essentially a set of bicycles and a couple of rust buckets. And by the time he left to be GCSA, it had, and I quote, some Mercedes. And John Beddington talked about the UK becoming as good at using its science advice, so being as world-class at using its science advice as it is known for the science in the first place. And I think that's a real challenge to us. And then finally, and this is just one more reflection on kind of what works in the government space in working with ministers and with policy. There's a huge amount of insightful material in the essays, but if I had one message to add, it would be something about rhythm. This is distilled from working with ministers in science-related and generalist jobs. So we all know there's a time when the physical or the biological world really asserts itself in a kind of completely unavoidable way. So the volcanoes, the measles epidemics, ministers know that they want answers. We need to be there to help. The same is actually true for rapid political events. So the moment when, say, the agenda for the G8 summit crystallises, or some major negotiation, you have to be, or someone has to be, in the room, giving well-expressed advice based on their own expertise, plus probably some really nifty footwork and superb networks. That gets things done. It moves things forward. It also builds the relationships with the customer, if you like, the ministers, and it builds trust. It provides proof of concept that science advice can be useful. It's not always arcane. It's not always better in 6 months' time. It's not always complicated. And it creates demand. So it's part of the virtuous circle that we're really on already, but we could go a lot further on in having, as it were, intelligent customers for the advice that we want to give. Now, I'm not a musician, but I would say that most people who are effective in government on the policy side are also capable of working at two rhythms at once, so syncopated rhythm or something like that. They respond expertly in the moment, but they are very clear about keeping a direction, a sense of direction, a sense of the big picture of the complexity. The diagram on the right is the systems diagram from a foresight project on obesity. And at this distance, all it says is it's very complicated and it's all interconnected. And that's true, but it's not always helpful for a specific decision. It's just that you have to keep that big picture in mind, whether it's obesity or energy. So to be effective, it's about having that big picture, being able to take people with you and as you build evidence and build a case for the directions that the evidence is taking you, but actually also respond in the syncopated fashion as well. And finally, while I'm, as it were, putting the case for what it feels like to work with ministers, I wanted to pick up on a point that Jeff Mulgan makes in his article in the essays, which is about empathy. I was struck by a very human remark by Francis Maud to a select committee last year. He listed the values of the civil service to the select committee, which are honesty, objectivity, impartiality and integrity, all of which I would say apply to practicing scientists equally. And he said these are very good values, and then he said, but they're quite cold. And politics is hot. So in our work, we need to keep to those values, but to constantly make it easier for ministers to absorb the advice that we're able to give as they deal with the heat all around them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. And we're going to hear now from Laura.
Okay, so this morning I'm going to talk briefly about the importance of using the scientific method to find out what works in policy, and perhaps even more importantly, in a time of austerity, getting a handle on what we might call the relative cost effectiveness of different policy options. So I want to start with a cautionary tale which takes us to the US in the 1970s. The problem of juvenile delinquency was tackled by a program called Scared Straight. Essentially, the idea was that we would expose juvenile delinquents, at-risk children, to a program where they were taken into prisons and exposed to the consequences of a life of crime. So what would be likely to happen to them if they pursued a life of criminality? This is pretty scary stuff. So the idea was to scare them straight. And initial research looked at sort of before and after evaluations. So looked pretty successful. We had success rates of up to kind of 94%. And the program was sort of widely rolled out in the US and including in other countries. Now, none of these studies actually had a control group. So researchers couldn't actually establish what would have happened to these kids if they hadn't been exposed to the Scared Straight program. And eventually, some people got around to running some randomized trials where some children were assigned to the Scared Straight intervention and some were not, and then followed up over time. And the results were pretty troubling. So a meta-analysis of 7 US trials found that Scared Straight actually led to higher rates of offending behaviour. In fact, the report suggested that doing nothing would have been better than exposing juveniles to this program. And indeed, a recent piece of work by Dartington Social Research suggests that the costs associated with the program, largely related to the increase in offending behaviour, were around 30 times that of the benefits. So why tell you this story? Well, conventionally in government, in the UK and indeed elsewhere, if we look to roll out a policy and evaluate it, we roll it out and observe whether outcomes have changed. This is not always the case, but it is often the case with flagship policies, and I think leaves us unsure as to whether our policies actually had the desired impact on outcomes, which is probably a pretty critical question when we've got scarce taxpayer money. And also the second issue is, have we actually inadvertently caused harm despite the best intentions? So as a behavioural scientist, I'd argue we need to be pretty humble about what works. So a lot of government policy, health, energy, savings and pensions, to name a few, hang on influencing citizen behaviour. And it turns out human behaviour is pretty complex and often counterintuitive. So it's nicely demonstrated by a recent experience of the Israeli tax authority, who found that including moral persuasion in their communications about corporation tax to companies resulted in a marked reduction in tax collection, costing around £90 million. But the key point here is that they were aware of this. They were aware that changing the letter in this way had this negative impact, precisely because they'd run a randomised controlled trial. So, as many of you will know, RCTs are the gold standard of evidence generation, now widely used in clinical medicine to determine whether drugs are effective, and NICE rely on evidence gleaned from RCTs to determine whether new drugs are in fact value for money for the NHS. And that's because RCTs enable us to establish the counterfactual, so what would have happened if we hadn't changed the status quo? Also, if we combine this carefully with monetisation of inputs and outputs, we can get a handle on cost effectiveness, which is certainly a nice tool to have when considering different policy options. Now, I should point out that the Behavioural Insights team wasn't set up to get into the randomised controlled trial space. Instead, there was simply a clear recognition when the coalition came in, that an understanding of real-world human behaviour had the potential to improve policy design. So you can see there an excerpt from the coalition agreement. So we were set up, a small team in the Cabinet Office in July 2010 with a specific task of applying behavioural science to public policy. So the early days were really interesting times for us. It's safe to say that there were a few skeptics out there, both in the media, as you can see, but also in Whitehall. There was certainly a sense, I think, in Whitehall that this behavioural insight stuff, was it just sort of repackaged customer insight, something that we were already doing anyway, and didn't in and of itself have really much value to add. So we found ourselves in a pretty interesting position as a small team. We needed to demonstrate first that applying behavioural science to public policy was of value, and secondly, that we were worth having around as well. So our approach was to kill both of these birds with one stone, essentially by using that other cornerstone of behavioural science, the experimental method and randomised trials. Since we've started publishing the results of the trials, there's been somewhat of a turnaround in the media, as you'll see there, but I think also in Whitehall. So the presentation today is not about kind of BIT's greatest hits and the suite of trials that we've done. But if you're interested in our work, you can check out our website. I should point out that we've had rather more success than the Israeli tax authorities through the use of social norms in tax letters. And overall, we've demonstrated around 22 times, savings of over 22 times the cost of the team in 2 years. So here are a few of the policy areas where we've been running trials. And I'm just going to give you one example to illustrate our way of working. So this is a trial that we conducted with the court service when we were asked by our steering board to look into fraud, error and debt in the system. All right, so this is, again, really early days for us. So it was quite difficult to convince people to give us some of their customers to run trials with. And we managed to convince the court service that they should give us a sample of cases where they'd already tried absolutely everything to get these people to pay their court fines, including things like written warnings of potential arrest, confiscation of their property. And so these people were due to be referred to the bailiffs, which is probably not a great experience. So we designed a trial to step in just before that happened. So we found that the court service held mobile numbers of some of these clients, and given we'd exhausted the kind of letter route of communication, we decided to try sending them some text messages to encourage them to pay their fine. You can see an example up there on the slide. So we ran a trial in 3 regions of southeast England, and we used what you'd call a multi-stage, multi-arm, adaptive randomised trial. So these are often used in medicine to increase trial efficiency, largely by reducing the number of people exposed to what turns out to be an inferior treatment. So we had 5 arms of this trial. It's actually one of our hallmarks to try and test out multiple variants. So the question for us is not just what works, but what works best. So we had a no-text condition, the status quo, and then we had 4 text arms where we tried different variants, so including the individual's name at the front, the amount that they owed, or both. So we assumed that text messaging was going to be would be superior to sort of not sending a text. And so once we had sufficient numbers to support that hypothesis, we closed that arm and allocated everybody else to the four text arms. So this effectively results in a 2-stage trial. And here we have the results. So no surprise, the no-text condition was clearly underperforming. So for the second phase, we closed that arm down, maximising statistical efficiency, pouring all the statistical power into the other 4. So pooling the data for both of the trials, we find that relative to the standard text condition, including the individual's name up the front, results in the highest rate of payments and encourages people to pay more. So calculations, which we did together with the court service, suggest that there's around about 500,000 of these cases each year. And if we use personalised text messages, we're talking about savings of around £800,000. The important thing is it's not just about the money, though, right? It's also that we've helped people avoid the economic and emotional consequences of having a visit by the bailiffs. So since we started publishing our trial results, we've been inundated by requests from the public sector, the private sector also, and overseas governments about behavioural insights and trials and whether they might help them. So together with a couple of academic co-authors, including Ben Goldacre, who, by the way, in April 2011, called for us publicly in The Guardian to all be fired, is now very much on board with what we do. And we published this paper on running RCTs. I think it's quite accessible, exposes some of the common myths, and sort of outlines the key steps to running an RCT, including, critically, getting someone involved who kind of knows what they're doing. Interestingly, for such a niche document, it's actually one of the most downloaded publications on the Cabinet Office website. Also, in response to the growing demand and interest in RCTs, I've recently set up what we're calling a trial design advisory panel. And we're going to offer free advice to the public sector on how to run trials in their policy area. It's pretty small for now, but perfectly formed. And we've got leading academics and experts from government involved who have lots of experience in how to achieve rigour with pragmatism. So it's going to be quite far from a kind of Dragon's Den operation. The ideas will be flexible and respond to the needs that come our way. So we're going to be involved in anything from scoping the potential for trials in policy areas where they're not currently widely used, to advising on the specific design of low-cost, statistically efficient trials, to offering guidance on how to put together an ITT when commissioning trials from external research bodies. So please get in touch if you're interested to find out more. Just to wrap up, I just want to mention a couple of things that we're very keen to champion with this panel. And that's the potential to do better, smarter evaluation in government. The Behavioural Insights team, we've managed to keep costs really low. We've run over 30 RCTs with virtually no evaluation cost other than the cost of the people in the team. And we've worked with a number of academics who've kindly donated their time because we've managed to align the incentives. So if we conduct a trial where we find some interesting results, then they can publish an academic paper off the back of that. One of the things that's really helped us to keep costs low is the use of routine admin data rather than going out and generating primary outcome measures using what's there already. I think there's a couple of key policy features which make natural opportunities for RCTs. So firstly, when we're in a situation where services might be oversubscribed, you might argue what's a fairer way than to decide who should receive the service other than through some kind of lottery or random mechanism. So we're currently in discussions with one of the big departments who are in precisely this situation with one of their flagship policies. And it's my hope that they'll introduce an element of randomisation which will help us establish what is precisely the value add of the service on offer. Secondly, for some policies you might be in a situation largely resource constraints might mean that you need to roll out your policy on a staggered basis. So Sure Start is a really good example of this. One area went first and then the next and then the next. This is a great chance to build in randomisation. And it's again about building in the rigour while accepting that there are real-world policy constraints and so building in some pragmatism as well. So final slide. This is just an example of a staggered rollout design that we're currently running. Now, we ran a pilot trial in a job centre which was essentially a new way of advisors interacting with job seekers who'd recently signed on to benefits. Now, the results were really positive, but we want to scale it up and put the intervention to a more robust test. So the region that's keen to work with us on this had 12 job centres, and the most statistically efficient way to run this trial, as it needed to be randomised at the job centre level. If you do it within job centre, you get contamination between advisors, was to use this step wedge design. So we have a situation where each month we bring on a new job centre online into the intervention, and we're using the outcome measures which are close to job centres' hearts as they're performance managed on 13-week off-flow rates. So after 13 weeks, after someone's signed on to benefits, are they still on benefits or not? So the reason I want to use this example is essentially you can achieve rigour with pragmatism. So you can see there's sort of green, amber and red. The job centres were in 3 different stages of readiness in terms of the management structure and their ability to implement change, quite significant change, with fidelity to the intervention. So what we decided to do was randomise within each of those 3 categories of readiness. And so you can see, as a result, we have a really nice step wedge design, but it also works really well for the job centre advisors. To wrap up, if you're interested to find out more about us and our work, you can check out our website. And I'd also like to thank CSaP for offering me the opportunity to be a policy fellow. I've only just started my time, but I've already really had some super interesting conversations with academics, and I'm heading up there again next week. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Look, just before you sit down, can I just ask as one...
Sure.
That fascinating overview of the work of the team. How do you see all of that linking with Go Science, the CSAs? Are those connections strong enough? Could they be stronger? Just a minute on that.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. Yes, definitely those kinds of linkages can always be stronger. But I think what's kind of different about the behavioural insights team is rather than engaging with a sort of top-down structured approach to doing science on policy, as it were, we've actually gone for the bottom-up approach. So finding opportunities, natural opportunities, to run randomised trials and just getting on and doing it, as opposed to engaging in more structured debates across government about the merits of the approach. Having said that, now that we've established ourselves and demonstrated the merits of this approach, we are starting very much to get more involved in discussions with Go Science, with the cross-government evaluation group, and others. So I think this is the beginning of something hopefully quite big, but with the caveat that we're very much aware that this is a long game.
Thanks. Thank you. Claire, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that one way of thinking about this is that some of what the Behavioural Insight team have been doing is, in some sense, kind of proof of concept. It's been actually building examples and understanding about how it's going to work, and we increasingly can spread that. We've got the networks and the ways of ensuring that gets picked up and used beyond those who've had direct contact with it. And it's incredibly valuable stuff that they've done.
Great. Well, I'm sure we can pursue that line of questioning a bit in the Q&A that are to come. Our final speaker is Ulrike Hottop, Director for Analysis and Chief Economist at DEFRA.
And perhaps just to add to what was just said about Laura's presentation, I think some of what the Behavioural Insights team is doing is really using social science insights much more in policy making, and then also using evaluation to establish kind of on-site evaluation to establish what works and adjusting policy there and then. And I heard your colleague Owen Service yesterday at the UK Evaluation Society's conference where he made those points also very clearly. And I think it's an excellent example of the use of social science in policy making. So there's clearly a link to that, James. So, right, I'm Ulrike Hotham, and I'm the Director for Analysis, but also the Chief Economist in DEFRA. So you might get a bit of the dismal science in the next few minutes as well. So don't despair over that. But just to give you a bit of the context of DEFRA at the moment, you see a picture of our Secretary of State, Owen Paterson. He was brought into DEFRA to make sure that DEFRA contributed to economic growth, which is lacking a little bit, and we've already heard about austerity from Claire and others earlier. So his 4 key priorities are to grow the rural economy, and that he means that in the wider sense, including food production, which is also, of course, food processing, etc. To improve the environment and to safeguard animal and plant health. But through all of this runs this strand of improving economic growth or getting us back onto a path of economic growth. And you know there's a hugely challenging context right now, and I just wanted to remind you of that because I think it's important for science, particularly what we just heard from Laura, of getting types of intervention right that don't cost too much money. There are very high demands from customers and stakeholders to get high levels of service in all areas. There's a very fast, pacey world out there with 24/7 media, and we have to understand that because that is what drives policy decisions, and therefore that is what has to drive how analysis and evidence is working in that context. The economic situation, don't need to say much more about that, and there's a shrinking civil service and a shrinking public sector, but despite what Claire has said about the size of the civil service itself, from the side of government spending and all of government and the public sector in the economy, it is actually an attempt to get that back to a level where it was in 2004-05, where the size of the public sector and the total economy was about 39-40%. It's currently about 44%, so it's trying to get that down to where it was not all that long ago. And I think that's quite an important point for us to remember what that might mean. Yes, and the world is getting more complex. But and I have to refer a little bit to my notes because I took a lot of notes while other people were speaking, and I want to make sure things fit together. Evidence has to help decision makers to take the right decisions. So that is the key challenge. And the decision makers, they are in politics, they are the Owen Patersons and other ministers, but they are also all the individuals who are taking decisions for themselves. And again, Laura showed really interesting examples how one can influence people to take the right decisions, whoever decides what the right decisions are. And that is where evidence, science, social science, etc., are coming in to provide that type of information. So the evidence has to be of high quality and it has to be relevant. And I really liked Sir Mark's reference back to history. And just to remind you, Adam Smith, who's always seen as the founder of economics as a science, was not really an economist. He was a moral philosopher, as well as looking at the economy and other science. So he was a much broader mind than just economics. And we have to think of our evidence functions and our evidence providers in government and in the wider stakeholder groups also as that kind of wider, thinking about other science, thinking multidisciplinary, rather than just having one opinion. Yesterday I went to the Howard Dalton lecture, and we had a very interesting talk where the speaker, and I might have to ask Miles Parker to pronounce her name properly, talked about multi-opinions, so that you don't get just one expert opinion, but have the multi-opinioned evidence provided for decision makers. But we have to use now, coming back to more grounded and real-life experience, we have to influence, that is the scientific evidence community in government, we have to influence the UK, European Union, and we have to influence at international level using the best technologies we have and trying to drive smarter, to drive innovation to be smarter, faster, cheaper, as I put it here, but always being aware that the civil service and the civil servants don't have all the knowledge. Even if there are 400,000 of us, that is far fewer than there are bright minds in the whole country or the whole world. And we have to make best use of all of that. And for that, we have to bring in academia, private research funds, etc., but also to get the multidisciplinary aspects. One thing I wanted to talk about was risk and how risk is dealt with. A lot of the policy areas that we are dealing with, where science are coming in, is actually, there are social, economic problems, but social problems because people have to accept decisions. And in many cases, it is about dealing with risk, whether it is the risk of eating a certain lasagna where you're not quite sure whether it's got horse meat, beef, or what in it, where you might say, well, the risk to health is not that big, but then it got this little edge when they found some beauty in a product. Or whether it's about the risk, the global risk of climate change. How can countries, how can individuals deal with that risk? And I think it's for sciences, for evidence, which I always mean the broader science, the multidisciplinary aspect, of clearly identifying that risk and then giving policymakers the options of dealing with that. But in that, we always have to deal with the perceptions of the public out there, who might not be as rational, as Sir Mark put it earlier, as we as scientists would expect it. But on the other hand, that might just be a different type of rationality, which we need to explore and then understand to intervene properly. And again, I think that's where the behavioral insights is coming in, because it can help us understanding that different type of rationality that people might have to make their decisions in their private lives. This is basically, I've already said all of that, but there are the two words, what works, on there. And we are also working with the ESRC to set up a What Works Center to understand better where DEFRA policies are going. But I wanted to use one particular case study, just briefly at the end, to outline what it is, what I meant by what I said so far. There was the cholera outbreak, that ash dieback, a huge panic. We had the Prime Minister said he would not be responsible, or he would not preside over the death of the ash tree in this country. Quite a strong statement. For the fact, when you look at it from an economic point of view, it's a shame about the ash trees, but it's not going to have an impact on the economy, not really. Right? There might be a few people who grow ash trees, but that's about it. So not a big economic impact. You looked at the science. The fungus had been blown over, probably from Denmark. There was no way of stopping it in any shape or form. So the science told us, we can't eradicate this, we can't stop it. But on the other hand, people wanted, people cared, the society cared. So we needed to bring in those social aspects and to understand what it was that people cared about. And therefore, the impact of the disease is not just about ashes, certain trees are dying, and what's the science of that, or a few companies are going down the tubes, but it's really understanding what it is that people are caring about. And therefore, it was important to get a cholera management plan ready, and now to try and address the problem and find trees that are resistant against this particular disease. And we got a pat on the back from the government chief scientific advisor for the use of evidence in this particular decision making. Thank you. There's another slide which I don't want to show because I don't think it fits into what we are discussing now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ulrika. So in the spirit of open policy making, we are going to shut up and hand over to you. We'd like to hear questions, comments directed at any one or indeed all of us up here on the platform. We've got about 40 minutes for discussion, so we should have a bit of time. And what I suggest is that we take sort of questions in groups and then bring them back, because that way we can get a more flowing discussion. There are roving mics, and we'll start with the gentleman over there.
Thank you for excellent talks. I've got a question for Claire.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Woody Kahn, editor of the Journal of Public Mental Health, and I'm talking from the point of view of a population scientist. Claire, you mentioned something that's been happening in the last 2 years, which has caused huge headaches for me in terms of scientific advice around health, and that is the localism agenda. So, for example, your wedge and circle of the academic community and the civil service, if we look at population scientists, there's now a new national body, Public Health England, and there are 150 local authorities, and they're not in step, and the academic community is not growing or going in direction that is in step with either of those. Do you have any comments on how the academic community can work with the localism agenda?
Great, thank you. Right at the back there, if there's a mic.
My name is David Walker. I'm a member of council at the ESRC. In your excellent collection today, there's a missing contribution, and that's from political science. Now, that's either because political science doesn't extraordinarily have anything to offer about understanding the policy process of government, or that the conversation hitherto about science and government may be missing a limb. And I just lay on the table the question of why we don't, whether we know enough about policy and politics yet, whether there's a missing set of case studies about evidence in government, whether there's a literature which we either don't have or don't have access to that might elucidate why, in the past or now, these questions resolve themselves in the way they do, which in your terms today have resulted in a deficit.
Thank you. Yes, in the middle there, Roland Jackson. Sorry, up there.
Thank you. Miles Parker from the Cambridge Centre for Science and Policy. I think you were offering the microphone to Roland Jackson. Sorry, Roland. But it's come my way. I just want to pick up on something that David Volker said, which abuts on something you said yourself, James, and that was about whether there was a need for a cross-government evidence service. And I'd like to challenge the idea and seek views from the panel. I think there's the concern I have, it hangs around the word evidence, which is itself a challengeable word. We seem to be using it in the sense that evidence is something provided by experts, and I think that is really quite dangerous. One can see a lot of benefit to a cross-government joining up of expert advice. But I think we should never forget that a large amount of the evidence that goes into any policy decision falls into that area that Mark Walpole was calling judgment. And in particular, it includes the experience and knowledge of the civil servants involved in taking decisions, as well as the experience and knowledge of the wider public. Hence, my support for David's question about the role of policy science in this particular context. Thank you.
Thanks, Miles. Second time. Roland.
Just a quick question to Laura. In medical trials, there is an ethical committee, an independent ethical committee that oversees the trial to ensure that no party is severely disadvantaged if the trial is successful. The trials are cut short if that happens. What ethical structure is there to support the Cabinet Office efforts to do randomised trials?
Third attempt. Roland Jackson.
Thanks very much. It better be a good question after that, hasn't it?
You've built it up now, Roland.
Roland Jackson from ScienceWise. A question, particularly to Ulrika, but I think to others, about this question of rationality and rationalities. To what extent can you characterise publics as having different rationalities from civil servants or policy advisors? Is there a monolithic rationality in the civil service and policy advice? And do you not really mean, sort of underlying that, the way that people bring those values and judgments that Mark talked about into the process? And if that's the case, it's really critical that open policy making includes openness to understanding not just surveying, but understanding those public values and thoughts and opinions.
Great. We'll pause and come back to the panel. We've got a nice spread there. Claire on localism, Laura on trials, Ulrika on rationalities, or others may chip in. And all of you may have views on this idea of an evidence service, pros and cons. Let me just first quickly answer David's question about political science. I think it's a very fair point. And inevitably, one could have invited other chapters. I mean, Jeff Mulgan in his chapter does talk about the contribution of political science in the context of what we know about how policy making works. But I completely agree with you that that's one field, a very important study that needs to be given perhaps a greater prominence and hearing in the mix. I think the broader message we were trying to convey is simply that there is this breadth. The question is how and in what ways different disciplines play in and are treated in hierarchical or non-hierarchical terms within the policy process. Claire.
Thank you. So on localism, I had two thoughts really, because I think it is it's a good question and there isn't a simple answer. One of them was going with it, and I was thinking there about the increasingly important and kind of rich way in which higher education institutions themselves are kind of operating across all sorts of different political, social kind of boundaries and becoming linchpins in a sort of different way within at least regional economies, which includes local economies. So my one thought was, what is your university doing? My other is around networks. And for example, the previous Chief Scientific Advisor at the Communities and Local Government Department set up a network on behavioural research, I know, which also reached out. That was my second answer to the question. And finally, I was going to use it for a plug, which is that we're shortly starting a new foresight project on cities. And I think this question of very much all different kinds of information, social and sort of ICT and so forth, what's available to whom and how we use that, not in a top-down way but in a bottom-up way, to have healthy, wealthy cities and safe cities is a really interesting one, so hopefully you can contribute to that. While I may on the cross-government evidence service, I completely agree with Mar's point about there being all sorts of evidence and expertise, and I think a sort of simple label, kind of it is or it isn't evidence, would be actually very unhelpful. I think there's something else going here about signalling. We tend to sort of think about these questions, do we need this service, or do we need a chief social scientist, for example? We think about them as kind of permanent states, and they're not. When you're looking at a really complex system like government and everything that goes on around it, there are things that you need to do to signal. I think that something like the Behavioural Insight Team is an example of an area where it was really important to say there's something important happening here. It's experimental and it's evolving and it needs to be very visible. And over time, much of what it does will get mainstreamed in the way that Laura was talking about. So I'm not sure what an evidence service would add in that kind of more fluid context.
Laura.
So in answer to Roland's question regarding trials and ethics, I absolutely agree in the context of the health space that should the Behavioural Insights team be running any trials, that we would engage in exactly the same kind of processes that are required by academics and others who are conducting randomised trials to investigate how to improve healthy behaviour. This all goes back to the Geneva Convention. It's absolutely appropriate that those kinds of formal ethical procedures should be followed. In the case where the trials that we're conducting are sort of minor tweaks on existing consumer touch points. So, for example, a lot of our early work was sort of piggybacking on existing communications, so letters, text, things like that. We didn't take the view that ethics was something that we needed to go for. Personally, I would actually like it if we could have some kind of quick turnaround ethical committee for the team. It needs to be quick turnaround where our work packages are decided by our steering board, and they request that we return in 3-4 months' time with a package of work, so that necessitates very, very quick working. Just to turn the question on its head slightly, it seems to be ethically appropriate in government to roll out policies that we don't know whether they work or not. So I think that's worth considering in this context as well.
Thanks. Ulrika, multiple rationalities.
Thank you. Multiple rationalities. We could have a whole seminar about that, I think. Now, you will know that the economics, my own profession, has a certain definition of rationality, and that is that you use all available information to maximize your utility in your decision making, more or less. Now, this type of rationality, which for companies means profit maximization, is applied every day in government decision making because it feeds into every impact assessment that has standard economic analysis in it. That's the first thing. I'm not saying that there's a monolithic civil service type of rationality, but we do need to be aware of the fact that this underlying assumption feeds into the economic analysis because standard welfare economics is used in all these cost-benefit analyses. And that might be the right thing, because if you assume too many different types of rationality, and probably everybody in this room might have at least one form of a rationality, how they take certain decisions, or perhaps even more, depending on the situation they are in. So you might take a certain decision now that you would not take this evening, etc., because other pieces of information are coming in, and therefore you decide differently. But we do need to be careful. If we have too many types of rationality, then you can explain everything and therefore nothing. And if you try and govern for the whole country, you do need to use some form of average. How do people behave on average? Because else you can't formulate policies that make sense for all these different individuals with all their different types of rationalities. I think that is quite an important point. But I also think it's important to bring in, as you suggested, the different experiences that civil servants have, but also that all the other stakeholders have, and that hopefully the open policy-making process can help us to do, but with that bit of warning at the end.
Great. Thank you, Ulrika. Let's take another round. Stephen Hill, I see there.
Thank you. Stephen Hill from RCUK. I have a question or I'm interested in the panel's reflections on something that struck me during Mark Warput's talk. So I think it was very welcome to see him emphasizing the importance of looking at policy problems and policy questions from a range of different perspectives. But for me, that then raises the important question about how do we determine what those different perspectives are? How do we know we've got a full set of different perspectives, and who decides what weighting is given to those different perspectives when decisions are finally made? So in many ways, it opens up many questions. And I wonder whether, to link to another thing that Mark said, that part of the answer to that is really to think through how public engagement can help us understand what perspectives there are that need to be taken into account, and how then evidence is gathered to inform decisions based on those perspectives. So I'd be really interested in the panel's reflections on that point.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, there, and then George.
My name is Rupert Lewis, the Deputy Chief Scientist in BIS. James, I'd like to just make a comment and ask for your reflection on it on your talk. I have to admit I find this kind of debates about whether one should have a social scientist or an engineer or scientist or whatever as a chief scientist a little bit tired. Laura's presentation, an ecologist could have made a very similar presentation, because ecologists do randomized controlled trials and are trained in statistical skills. Some scientists are modelers, some of them are empiricists. Would you have a neuroscientist or whatever? The key question really is, what do those people do? What skills do they have? Do you know, if you're a scientist or a social scientist or whatever, do you know the economists And the experts that you need to call, do you know them by their first names? Can you get their advice within 24 hours? If you're sitting in a meeting with a minister and you've got 10 minutes, do you know how to make the right intervention that people will walk away with the advice that you've given and act on it or take account of it? Can you condense a world of knowledge into a paragraph? It's what you do that seems to be more important than necessarily where you've come from. I mean, I think last night at the Howard Dalton lecture, I think the Deputy Chief Scientist made a really interesting comment, which was, you might start out in government as a scientist and end up as a social scientist. I can't help thinking that you end up as an operational researcher because you're really conscious of the system that you work in and the importance of gauging in that. So my comment, if your reflection is, would it be more useful to move on from what you are to what you do?
Great. Jill Rutter. Here. Yep, there's a mic.
Hi, I'm Jill Rutter. I'm from the Institute for Government. I wrote one of the contributions. When I was writing it, I was debating whether to say that actually having this sort of eminent model for government chief scientists was actually counterproductive. Because what it meant was basically the government science profession was a sort of decapitated profession. It's very, very striking how few people from the science profession had crossed over into mainstream policy making. And I did some analysis of permanent secretaries, 2 of whom have a maths background. No one else has a science or technical degree, as I now have learnt through our seminar series to do it. And I was wondering, and particularly relating as well to what Jeff has said in his piece about these people actually being there because of the skills they have in sort of brokering, synthesizing, etc., rather than being distinguished, very distinguished contributors in their own field. Whether I actually should have said that things like the House of Lords, etc., were barking up the wrong tree by saying you really want deeply eminent people, almost like, we've managed to secure this prize, and actually you really wanted a science profession that was much more integral to what Whitehall did.
Thanks, Jill. And yes, lady here at the front.
Thank you. Catherine Cunningham. I did spend some time in the Cabinet Office when the Science and Technology Secretariat was there. And just a point of information, John Fairclough, who was at that time the Government Chief Science Advisor, was an engineer. It seemed to me that were the the government chief scientist to move back into the Cabinet Office, there might be a stronger voice for science. Could I have comments on that, please?
Great, we'll come back again at that point. Some good questions there. Again, let me just take Rupert's question first, because that was partly directed at me. I mean, I think, I would agree wholeheartedly, Rupert, with what you're saying, that we do want to move away from a focus on who these people are to what they do. And I suppose that's one of the big emphases of the whole collection, and particularly this emphasis on intermediary skills as being more important than deep disciplinary expertise. That said, we all know that in the way the debate about chief scientific advisors and the science advisory system is conducted in places like this and in other learned societies, etc., there is a focus on, in a way, replicating the disciplinary structures that we're all familiar with as academics and sort of fighting for turf for our particular tribe in the Whitehall jungle, if I be forgiven for using more jungle metaphors. So there is an issue there, and I suppose that's what we were trying to point to. And I think if you look at, for example, the job description I quoted in the introduction for your own boss, Rupert, as the chief scientist at BIS, it says in the terms of reference for that post that the post holder should ideally be a fellow of the Royal Society or a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. Now, I'm the first person, having worked for several years here at the Royal Society, to applaud the excellence of the fellowship of this place and indeed of our neighbours along the road. But one can't be saying it doesn't matter who they are, it matters what they do, and at the same time maintaining a selection criteria that is so elite in its specificity, given that we know already, from the election process here, quite how many excellent scientists there are who never make FRS because of the number of seats there is every year. So, there is a real issue in delivering on that idea in the actual operation of the system, which I think does need more thinking, through. Enough from me. Claire.
Ulrika is
Yeah,
Sorry,
very keen to come
just
in.
what you said, what Rupert said, made me think back to the Calara example. And there, it is important that you have somebody who people trust. And Claire had this fantastic chart where the trust for scientists, or trust in scientists to say the truth or to tell the truth has gone up. And I think the eminence is part of, it's probably one signal to try and get somebody who's got that trust of the population. They also, of course, then need to be able to do those things that you've described and to look at the complex text and to say, yes, I think that's quite right, but this is wrong. But I think this element of trust is probably what people are looking for when they describe eminence. Sorry, Claire.
I'll carry on with that one. I think that I think it needs to be both in terms of what Jill was talking about. We do need to have ways of showing that you can be a scientist working in government and get to the top. We need to have people who have training in science at the top. Equally, one of the things that really has struck me is that the science community itself is clearly much more willing in many instances to engage because they feel that somebody who is very senior in their hierarchies is asking them to. So in addition to Ulrika's point that it may help with trust from the public, I think it also helps government to get trust from academics that it's that they will be treated well, that it won't be dangerous for them to engage with government because some of their own are inside. I just don't see that as incompatible with kind of getting better for the rest of us. So that was one thing. There was a question about prisons, and one of the things that's really struck me since Mark, in his kind of 3 weeks, has started talking about prisons, is that it's really helpful in, at least as a starting point, in kind of untangling some of those different rationalities. And an example for me would be, say, the way in which, in fact, the Academy's report on hydraulic fracturing of shale gas was doing it in practice. It basically didn't try and solve what does shale gas mean for the economy, for investment in renewable energies and climate targets. It just said, let's scope a narrow question. Let's look at this through one lens, which is basically what are the physical and environmental risks of this particular process. It was a tractable question, and it got an answer, and it's probably helped to make sure that debates on shale gas actually focus on the economic and environmental consequences, but don't get tangled up with whether we have earthquakes in Blackpool. So it sort of separated out an issue in prisons in the way that Mark's describing, although we didn't call it that. The other point, which I think was aimed more at me, was around where the government office for science sits. And obviously there are arguments. Both ways, and there would be things that were easier in cabinet if we were in cabinet office. Equally, it depends much more on the relationships, and there are quite good advantages to being very close to the research base, people who we sit along the corridor from. So I think there are good cases both ways.
Thanks. Anything to add to Rose?
Yeah, so I just want to go back to the question about a cross-government evidence centre. Personally, before that, I'd like to see some kind of mechanism in place for encouraging the funding of policies which work. So you'll not be surprised to hear me say that. But currently we don't have these kinds of mechanisms in the system. So if we have a multi-million-pound policy that's been running for several years, and yet we don't have any evaluation or evidence to suggest that it's actually effective in influencing policy outcomes. I'd like to see a situation where the system can challenge that, and policy strategists and senior civil servants far above my pay grade will have a better idea about how to achieve that, whether it's in the Treasury or whether it's in departments. But that's certainly something that I'd like to see. I'd just like to go back to the question about the localism agenda, which I don't know whether it was addressed really in the last round. So in terms of how academics can engage with local regions, I've talked a lot about large-scale randomised trials today, but clearly they're not the only way of generating evidence, right? So they're the gold standard, and ideally we'll be in a situation where we can put policies to that kind of test. But if we think of evidence as a kind of pipeline, perhaps the localism agenda is going to offer opportunities for local people to innovate and come up with local solutions that they might need support in terms of evaluation and working out how they're effective. And I'm not talking about randomised trials, I'm talking about different kinds of methods. And I certainly think that the academic community could support those local regions in ascertaining whether their local solutions are effective, with the view to potentially scaling up and telling other local regions what's worked for them.
Thank you, Laura. We've got time for one more round.
Say something about the first question, about to determine how different perspectives are included in evidence collection. Is that about right, Stephen? The slide that I didn't show is about the evidence investment strategy that we are developing in DEFRA, and it's a bit too specific. But one of the questions we are asking ourselves there is how we can make sure that we get all the different forms of evidence and knowledge, to include that into policy advice, and how to make sure we set up the right framework that people feel they can contact us, let us know what the evidence is, and not, because there is a bit of a it's quite easy to always contact the same points, to contact the research councils, to contact certain higher education institutions one knows, and people one knows out there. But I wonder whether one can set up something a bit like a market to, you will not be surprised to hear, to gather that type of information. But for that you need to make sure that the incentives of those providing the information and those using it are aligned. And I wonder whether we can use some of behavioural insights in that process.
Great, thank you. No, that's a good additional point. Yes, Teresa Marteau there, and then others up here.
Thanks very much, Teresa Marteau, Cambridge. I want the panel to reflect a little bit on a theme that's come up in Miles Parker's comments, and also in the keynote from Mark Walpert, concerning the relationship between evidence and values and judgments that are made. So we all know that evidence is not just one concept. There are various kinds that are in there, and similarly different kinds of judgments. And one particular example that I think would trouble quite a few of us in the room would be where there's very strong evidence of something that's effective, and yet it's not implemented in policy. We all know that can happen, but it was reflected on by the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee in their inquiry on behaviour change. And they used the example of alcohol policy, and they noted that over the last 15, 20 years that there was growing and now pretty compelling evidence about pricing and availability. And when government didn't act, they felt that it was incumbent on policymakers and politicians to articulate their reasons why they didn't. And I think that implicit in that was the idea that this might change the behaviour of policymakers and politicians. Whether it does or not, I don't know, but I'd be keen to hear the panel reflect on that.
Thank you. Another couple. Yes, here at the front.
Hi, I'm Arnaud Wegener from the London School of Economics. I understand that I'm one of the few political scientists in the room, so I will try to, I felt pressure to ask an intelligent question, if I can. Incidentally, my research is about the factors that shape research decisions in a political context, and my question to the panelists is exactly about that. As civil servants, the three of you are to some extent accountable and need to be accountable to ministers and MPs, so people who are elected and who are there because they were elected by the people. And I wanted to ask the three of you, to what extent do you feel exposed or sheltered from these political pressures? For instance, what is the difference of research being done just before an election and just after an election? And as I suppose that you will probably say that you are relatively sheltered from these pressures, can you please explain why you think it is so? Because I think it could be interesting for other countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a final question. Yes, lady there in the middle.
Thank you. I'm Fiona McAllister from the Academy of Social Sciences. And just picking up on what's been said already about some of the relative lack of attention in a way to the sort of whole social science of decision making, I just wondered if the panel would like to reflect a little on how the social science of how decisions are actually made in practice might fit into the evidence landscapes that you're working in. And in particular, if you'd like to say a bit more about how the recent initiative of the National What Works centres and the appointment of a senior advisor, what you feel that says and can contribute to the debate about whether we need to have disciplinary chief social scientists, for example. So just sort of connect up those dots. Thank you.
Great, now that's a good question. Right, we'll start this time with Ulrika and work that down.
Okay. Thank you. To start with the last question, DEFRA, for example, has a chief social scientist who is working very strongly on, for example, our What Works Centre, which I mentioned earlier, and on the whole evaluation agenda. But also, it is the role of the social scientist, which she is leading in DEFRA, to make sure that understanding the drivers of why people take certain decisions, how they perceive risks, how they perceive things that happen, like the ash dieback that I used as an example, to make sure that the interventions which are then designed have the desired outcome. And you can find loads of very interesting examples of the work that she and her team have done. But you will also find there is quite good guidance on how to conduct evaluations published on, I think it's the Treasury's website now, how to make sure that the evaluations are robust, etc., etc. But we mustn't forget that very often evaluations done in that way the results come quite late after the policy has been implemented, and that can cause all sorts of difficulties. But I think there are more social scientists than it might have appeared today in the presentations. About the accountability of the civil service, I'd be very interested to hear what Claire says. I think she's a bit more experienced than I am. But the civil service is there to deliver the policies of the government of the day and their election manifestos, etc. So from that point of view, they are sheltered behind the politicians and the policymakers. But on the other hand, the question of what kind of decisions civil servants take when they advise policymakers, we might not have a system where a civil servant ends up in prison if something goes wrong. But there is an accountability within the civil service system. At least that's how I perceive this. But yes, I would be interested to hear what Claire has to say.
Laura.
So on the What Works centres, clearly this is a really, really welcome development. We've got strong influence around sort of evidence synthesis and dissemination to local commissioners. I think one of the key challenges there is going to be for each centre to work out for their target audience, the commissioners that they're seeking to influence and disseminate their take on what works and what doesn't, is how to do that in a way that actually influences commissioners' behaviour. I think the Educational Endowment Foundation has made a really good start. They have a fantastically accessible website, but I imagine it's going to take more than that. And I'll be really interested to see over the next few years how each centre sort of squares that circle. On accountability and the degree to which civil servants are sheltered, just a slightly different take on that. I think one of the reasons why the Behavioural Insights team was able to get a whole lot of RCTs done in a whole range of policy areas relatively quickly, is because we started small. And we started on things that people didn't really care about. We were pretty much operating below the radar. So we didn't go out and argue that we needed to put the minister's favourite policy to a fair and robust test. Rather, we've been working from the bottom up, simply getting on and doing it. And I think that has really, for us, been a key part of our success. It'll be interesting for us in sort of the years to come, now that we are sort of more visible and people know who we are and what we do, the degree to which that same strategy is going to work.
That's great, thank you. And finally, Claire.
Okay. Well, I think that both Ulrika and Laura have talked very well or clearly about accountability. I don't think I can add much to that really, except, I mean, without beginning to sound pompous. We are there to deliver ministers' policies, and we've talked a lot here about evidence, and I think all of us personally hold a kind of commitment to science evidence, meaning many different things by science and probably many different things by evidence, but actually part of life is reconciling those two things if you ever feel they come into conflict. I haven't yet. Just as an example of how things can work well despite general elections, the Foresight project on mental capital and well-being was directly quoted in two quite different governments' strategies on mental health. And it was pretty explicit that the same really solid body of evidence was actually used as base for quite completely different policy decisions in some areas where they mattered to the government of the day, particularly about how interventionist you were going to be or how capable you were of subsidising certain things. Once you go digging, there are many more examples of good quality evidence where the political decisions may be different over time, and actually that's visible if you care to dig and look at it. It's not something that I feel kind of is almost needs more needs more explanation. My one other comment on that was we did a really interesting short piece of work on on identities and how notions of identity, this is a Foresight project, might change over the next 10 years. One of them, which is a warning to us all, one of the kind of key findings was the already visible way in which personal and professional identities are collapsing, and it's increasingly impossible to keep them apart. And actually, that is a challenge to civil servants, as it is to almost everybody else. But the way in which you used to be able to say things professionally, and as it, nobody would make a connection with what you were doing. Not that it was nefarious, but just that, that actually, I think that will probably shift behaviours subtly. I don't yet know how.
Thank you. We'll have a lot more opportunity to